Zexthara remembered the first time he saw a human with perfect clarity, the memory preserved in his mind like a crystal recording that refused to fade. It was during the Third Expansion Wars, when the Galactic Coalition forces had pushed deep into what the humans called the Outer Rim territories. The blue-green world of Kepler. 442b hung in the viewscreen of his command cruiser like a jewel against the star-scattered darkness, seemingly peaceful despite the orbital battle raging around it. Just another primitive species, his intelligence officer Subcommander Yilrak had reported with typical Korthani arrogance. They've barely achieved faster-than-light travel. Carbon-based bipeds. Average height about 2 meters, standard mammalian physiology. They call themselves humans, from a world they've named Earth. Their technology is at least 3 centuries behind ours. Zexthara had nodded, filing the information away as he would any routine briefing. The Coalition had encountered hundreds of such species during their expansion across the galaxy. Some joined willingly, others required gentle persuasion, and a few needed more direct convincing. It was all very civilized, very controlled. The humans would fall into line like all the others. The first human he actually laid eyes on was Captain Sarah Chen of the Earth Defense Force cruiser Indomitable. She had requested a parley under the ancient galactic codes of war, arriving at the neutral meeting point in a small shuttle that looked primitive compared to the sleek Korthani vessels surrounding it. Zexthara had agreed to the meeting more out of curiosity than any real belief that negotiation would be necessary. Captain Chen was smaller than he had expected, barely reaching his shoulder even with his natural Korthani slouch. Her dark hair was pulled back in a functional style, and her eyes were the color of the deep oceans on his homeworld. She wore a simple uniform that bore the scars of recent battle, and when she spoke, her voice carried the measured tone of someone accustomed to command. "Commander Zexthara," she had said, offering what he later learned was a human gesture of respect, a brief inclination of her head. "I come representing not just the Earth Defense Force, but all of humanity. We know you could overwhelm our defenses if you chose to. Our technology cannot match yours, and our numbers are vastly smaller. But we're asking you to consider an alternative to conquest." The translation matrix struggled with some of her words, concepts that didn't exist in standard galactic languages. Words like home, family, and sacrifice came through as rough approximations that failed to capture their true meaning. At the time, Zexthara had dismissed this as simply primitive emotional attachment, the kind of thinking that more advanced species had evolved beyond.
"What could you possibly offer the Coalition?" he had asked, genuinely curious.
"Your worlds have some mineral wealth, yes, but nothing we cannot obtain more efficiently elsewhere. Your technology is centuries behind ours. Your military poses no threat to our expansion plans." Captain Chen had smiled then, an expression that seemed to involve her entire face in a way that Zexthara found oddly compelling. "We offer ourselves," she said simply. "Human beings as willing participants in your coalition. We're adaptable, we learn quickly, and we have qualities that might prove valuable to an organization spanning multiple species and countless worlds. Such as, we don't break easily," she had replied. And something in the way she said it made Zexthara pause in his immediate dismissal. "We have a saying on Earth, pressure makes diamonds. We've spent our entire evolutionary history facing extinction-level challenges and finding ways to survive them. Ice ages, supervolcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, plague, war, famine. We've faced them all and kept going. We adapt, we innovate, and we never give up." The negotiations had continued for several hours, with Captain Chen presenting detailed proposals for human integration into coalition society. She spoke of their species' natural resilience, their problem-solving abilities, their potential contributions to science and exploration. She was passionate but controlled, logical but not cold, displaying a combination of traits that Zexthara found intriguing despite himself. What struck him most was her absolute refusal to consider surrender as defeat. Even facing overwhelming odds, she spoke not of submission, but of partnership. Not of conquest, but of collaboration. It was a perspective that challenged his understanding of how conquered species typically responded to subjugation.
"You speak of adaptation," Zexthara had finally said, "but what happens when your people refuse to adapt?"
"When they resist integration into a larger galactic community? We've seen it before with other species. There's always a period of rebellion, of terrorists and insurgents who cannot accept the new reality." Captain Chen's expression had grown thoughtful, and when she spoke again, her words carried a weight that Zexthara wouldn't fully understand until much later. "Commander, I think you misunderstand something fundamental about human nature. We don't resist change because we fear it. We resist it when it threatens the things we value most. Give us a path that protects what we hold dear, and we'll walk it willingly. Take away what we love, and... She had paused, searching for words that the translation matrix could handle. And you'll discover that humans can become something very different from what you see before you now. At the time, Zexthara had interpreted this as a veiled threat, the kind of blustering that primitive species often engaged in when faced with superior force. He had ended the negotiations with polite but firm rejection of her proposals. The coalition would proceed with standard integration protocols. Humanity would be absorbed into the greater galactic community, whether they chose cooperation or resistance. Captain Chen had stood to leave, but before departing, she had made one final statement that would haunt Zexthara for years to come. Commander, I want you to understand something. What you're seeing right now, this conversation we're having, this represents humanity at our most civilized, our most reasonable, our most willing to find peaceful solutions. We're capable of so much more, but we choose restraint because we believe in the possibility of coexistence. She had paused at the door of the conference chamber, turning back to look at him with those deep ocean eyes. But if you take away our choices, if you threaten not just our worlds, but our families, our children, our way of life itself, then you'll meet a very different version of humanity. And I promise you, Commander, that's not a meeting you want to arrange. The warning had seemed almost quaint at the time. Zexthara had fought the Zerathi hive minds, creatures that could turn entire planets into organic weapons. He had battled the crystalline entities that could manipulate matter at the molecular level. He had faced the void dancers, beings of pure energy who existed partially outside normal space-time. What could one small biological species possibly do that would concern a veteran of such conflicts? The answer came 3 months later, when the Coalition began implementing their integration protocols on the human colonies of the Outer Rim. The initial phases proceeded exactly as predicted. Human military forces, vastly outgunned and outnumbered, fell back in organized retreats. Civilian populations were relocated to designated zones for processing and eventual redistribution throughout Coalition space. Infrastructure was catalogued and prepared for integration into the larger galactic network. Everything went according to plan, until the Coalition forces reached the human colony world of New Harmony. New Harmony had been one of humanity's earliest successful terraforming projects, a garden world where they had built something that the translation matrices still struggled to render properly. The closest approximation was home culture peace place, but even that failed to capture the emotional resonance the word home carried for humans. It was where many of Earth's colonists had sent their families when the war began, believing it to be safely behind the front lines. When Coalition forces arrived to begin standard integration protocols, they found not resistance but something far more unsettling: absolute non-compliance. The humans didn't fight, didn't run, didn't even protest. They simply refused to cooperate in any way. Adults would not respond to interrogation. Children would not eat food provided by Coalition forces. Elderly humans sat in their gardens and stared at the sky as if the warships above them simply didn't exist. "It's like they've collectively decided we don't exist," reported Major Kexthal, the Korthani officer in charge of the New Harmony operation. "They won't acknowledge our presence, won't respond to our commands, won't even defend themselves when we attempt to relocate them by force. It's the most complete form of passive resistance I've ever encountered." Zexthara had ordered more aggressive tactics. Coalition forces began physically relocating humans to processing centers, separating families to break their resistance, cutting off communication networks to prevent coordination. Standard procedures that had worked on dozens of other species. The humans of New Harmony continued their silent non-compliance, but something else began to happen across human space. Reports started filtering in from other Coalition commanders, describing incidents that didn't fit any known pattern of resistance or rebellion. Small units of Coalition forces would simply disappear, leaving behind no trace except for scattered equipment and, sometimes, messages written in human languages that the translation matrices refused to process. "There's something happening here that we don't understand," Zexthara confided to his intelligence staff during a classified briefing 6 weeks into the New Harmony operation. "The humans aren't fighting us in any conventional sense, but our casualty rates are climbing steadily. We're losing ships, personnel, entire outposts, and we can't identify a clear enemy or understand their tactics." What they were beginning to encounter, though none of them understood it yet, was humanity's transformation from a species fighting for survival into something far more dangerous, a species fighting for the survival of everything they loved. The protocols that had successfully integrated hundreds of other civilizations into coalition society had triggered something in human psychology that no xenobiologist had predicted, and no military strategist had planned for. The humans weren't just adapting to the threat of conquest. They were evolving beyond the limitations of conventional warfare, beyond the boundaries of civilized conflict, beyond the comfortable assumptions that had governed galactic politics for millennia. They were becoming something that Captain Chen had tried to warn him about during their first meeting, something that would fundamentally change how every species in the galaxy understood the nature of war itself. But Zexthara wouldn't recognize what was happening until it was far too late to prevent it. By then, the transformation would be complete, and humanity would have shown the galaxy a new definition of the word nightmare. The first real sign that something had fundamentally changed came during the incident at Outpost Zara. 7. A small coalition monitoring station positioned on the edge of human space. It was staffed by a mixed crew of Korthani technicians and Zerathi analysts with minimal defensive capabilities. Its purpose was simple: to monitor human communication networks and provide early warning of any large-scale resistance movements. The attack, if it could be called that, began with the complete failure of the outpost's sensor networks. Not damaged, not destroyed, but somehow turned against themselves, displaying false readings that made it impossible for the crew to distinguish between reality and electronic phantoms. The station's automated defense systems began firing at empty space while ignoring actual threats. When the rescue mission arrived 3 days later, they found the outpost intact but empty. The entire crew had vanished without any sign of struggle, leaving behind only their equipment and a single message painted on the wall in what appeared to be human blood. You cannot conquer what you do not understand. The blood analysis confirmed it was human, reported the forensics team. But we found no human DNA anywhere else in the facility. No hair, no skin cells, no trace of human presence except for that message. It's as if they materialized just long enough to write it, then disappeared again. Similar incidents began occurring across coalition space with increasing frequency. Supply convoys would arrive at their destinations with their cargo intact but their crews missing. Communications relays would be found functioning perfectly but broadcasting streams of data that appeared to be random noise, until analysis revealed they were detailed intelligence reports on coalition military movements. Automated systems would begin behaving erratically, following their programmed instructions while somehow achieving completely different results. The humans weren't attacking coalition forces in any recognizable sense. They were making the very concept of occupation impossible by turning the coalition's technological advantages against itself. Every sensor could lie, every communication could be intercepted and altered, every automated system could become an unwitting saboteur. Zexthara began to understand that humanity was fighting a war unlike anything in galactic history. They weren't trying to defeat the coalition's forces, they were trying to make the coalition defeat itself. And somehow, impossibly, it was working. The first time Zexthara witnessed what humans had become occurred during the siege of Proxima Station, a massive orbital facility that served as humanity's primary command center for their outer colonies. The station was a marvel of human engineering, built into a hollowed-out asteroid and bristling with weapons that, while primitive by coalition standards, were cleverly positioned and surprisingly effective. The siege had dragged on for weeks. Coalition forces surrounded the station completely, cutting off all supply lines and communication networks. By every military calculation, the humans inside should have surrendered within days. Their weapons were running out of power, their life support systems were failing, and their food supplies had been exhausted. Yet they continued to resist. "Sir, we're detecting strange energy readings from the station," reported his sensor operator, a young Korthani named Ziltok, whose mandibles clicked nervously as he studied his displays. "The patterns don't match anything in our databases. It's almost like their technology is evolving while we watch." Zexthara moved to examine the readings himself. What he saw defied explanation. The humans' crude energy weapons were somehow producing output levels that should have been impossible with their power sources. Their defensive shields were holding against coalition bombardment that should have overwhelmed them hours ago. Most disturbing of all, the life support readings from inside the station suggested that the human population was not just surviving, but somehow thriving despite being cut off from all external resources. "Begin boarding operations," Zexthara ordered. "I want to see what they're doing in there." The first boarding shuttles met no resistance as they approached the station's docking bays. The massive doors opened as if welcoming them, and Coalition Marines encountered no defensive fire as they advanced into the station's corridors. It seemed almost too easy, which should have been warning enough. The Marines advanced through section after section of the station, finding it filled with humans going about their daily routines as if there were no siege at all. Children played in the corridors while adults worked at various tasks that seemed to serve no obvious purpose. They all smiled politely at the Coalition forces and stepped aside to let them pass, but none of them spoke or responded to questions. "It's like they're performing some kind of elaborate theater," reported Captain Rexamol, the Marine commander, leading the boarding operation. "They're clearly aware of our presence, but they're acting as if we're invisible, or perhaps as if our being here is somehow part of their normal routine." The Marines continued deeper into the station, following the layout maps provided by Coalition intelligence. But as they progressed, it became clear that the internal structure of the station had changed dramatically since those maps had been created. Corridors led to sections that shouldn't exist. Rooms opened onto spaces that violated the known dimensions of the asteroid, and gravity seemed to flow in directions that defied physics. "Sir, I think we're lost," Captain Rexmel reported, his usually steady voice showing signs of strain. "The navigation systems are showing impossible readings. According to our instruments, we've been walking through the same corridor for the past hour, but we keep encountering new areas that weren't there before." That was when they encountered the first transformed human. The being that appeared before the Marine squad looked human at first glance, but something was fundamentally different. It moved with a fluid grace that seemed to bend the laws of physics. Its eyes held depths that suggested vast intelligence beyond normal human capacity. And when it spoke, its words seemed to bypass the translation matrices and communicate meaning directly to the listeners' minds. "Welcome to our home," it said, though none of the Coalition Marines were entirely certain they had heard it speak aloud. "You've come such a long way to visit us. We've been preparing for your arrival." Captain Rexmel raised his weapon, but found that his hands wouldn't obey his commands. The weapon remained pointed at the floor, despite his efforts to aim it. Around him, his Marines experienced similar paralysis, not of their bodies, but of their aggressive intent. They could move, could think, could even retreat if they chose, but they found themselves completely unable to initiate violence. "What are you?" Rexmel managed to ask, struggling against the strange mental influence that seemed to be emanating from the transformed human. "We are what you made us," the being replied, and now its voice carried harmonics that suggested multiple speakers, though only one figure stood before them. "You forced us to choose between extinction and evolution. We chose evolution." The being gestured, and suddenly the Marines could see the station as it truly was. The corridors they had been walking through were not metal and composite, but living tissue, breathing walls that pulsed with organic rhythms. The humans they had passed were not separate individuals, but components of a vast collective organism that had grown throughout the station. The children they had seen playing were not children at all, but specialized forms designed to appear non-threatening while serving functions that the Marines' minds couldn't quite grasp. "You sought to conquer us by taking our homes, our families, our individual identities," the being continued, its words carrying emotional resonances that made several of the Marines weep without understanding why. "So we chose to become something that cannot be conquered because it cannot be separated from what it protects. We became our home. We became our family. We became each other." Captain Rexmel tried to process what he was seeing, but his training had never prepared him for anything like this. The humans hadn't just adapted to the threat of conquest, they had transcended the very concepts that made conquest possible. They had become something that existed beyond the reach of conventional warfare. "How?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Love," the being said simply. "You underestimated the power of love. When you threatened our children, our partners, our parents, our friends, we discovered that love is not just an emotion. It is a force that can reshape reality itself when concentrated and focused through absolute desperation." The transformed human moved closer, and Rexmil could see that what he had taken for a single being was actually multiple humans who had somehow merged while retaining their individual consciousness. Their faces shifted and flowed, showing different identities that spoke in harmonized voices. "We are Sarah Chen, who warned your commander about what we could become. We are Marcus Rodriguez, who held his daughter as your bombs fell on New Harmony. We are Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, who discovered how consciousness could transcend individual biological limitations. We are 10,000 humans who chose to become something greater than human, rather than accept extinction. The collective being reached out and touched Rexamil's forehead, and suddenly he was experiencing memories that were not his own. He felt the terror of human parents watching their children being taken away by coalition forces. He experienced the grief of partners separated forever by relocation protocols. He lived through the moment when humans across their colonies made the collective decision that if they could not protect their loved ones as individuals, they would become something that could protect them as a unified force. Your coalition seeks to impose order through control, the beings that had once been human explained as Rexamil staggered under the weight of their shared memories. You believe that conquest creates peace, that submission creates stability, but you never understood that there are things in this universe more powerful than force, more permanent than conquest, more determined than any military organization. Rexamil found himself back in the corridor, his marines around him, all of them changed by what they had experienced. The transformed humans were gone, or perhaps had never been there in any physical sense, but their message remained, carved into the consciousness of every coalition soldier who had witnessed the encounter. Tell your commander, the voice echoed in their minds as they retreated toward their shuttle, that humanity accepts your declaration of war. But we will not fight it on your terms. We will fight it on ours. The boarding shuttles returned to Zexthara's command ship carrying Marines who could barely speak coherently about what they had experienced. The official reports described hallucinations, psychological warfare, and possible exposure to unknown alien technology. But Zexthara could see in their eyes the same haunted look that he would later recognize in his own reflection. Sir, his intelligence officer reported during the debriefing, we're receiving similar reports from coalition forces throughout human space, encounters with beings that appear human but demonstrate capabilities beyond any known technology. Our xenobiologists are calling it impossible, but the evidence is undeniable. Zexthara studied the reports flowing in from across the war zone. Descriptions of humans who could appear and disappear at will, who seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, who could communicate across vast distances instantaneously, and who demonstrated an understanding of coalition technology that surpassed their creators' knowledge. They're not using technology, he realized with growing horror. They've become the technology. They've evolved beyond the limitations of individual biological existence. What he was beginning to understand was that humanity's response to the threat of extinction had triggered an evolutionary leap that compressed millions of years of natural development into months of desperate adaptation. They had discovered that consciousness was not limited to individual brains, that love could serve as a binding force more powerful than gravity, and that the threat to everything they valued could unlock capabilities that redefined what it meant to be alive. The siege of Proxima Station ended not with surrender or victory, but with the complete disappearance of the station itself. One moment it was there on the sensors, the next it had vanished as if it had never existed. No explosion, no debris, no energy signature indicating destruction. It simply ceased to be. Sir, his sensor operator reported with barely controlled panic, the station is gone, but we're detecting massive gravitational anomalies throughout the system. It's as if something incredibly massive is moving through space, but it's completely invisible to our instruments. That was when Zexthara received a communication on a frequency that his equipment insisted did not exist. The voice was unmistakably that of Captain Sarah Chen, though she spoke with harmonics that suggested she was no longer an individual being. Commander Zexthara, her voice carried across the impossible distance between dimensions. We want you to understand what you have accomplished. You sought to conquer humanity, and instead you have created something that exists beyond conquest. You wanted to absorb us into your coalition, and instead you have given birth to a force that will reshape the galaxy itself. The communication continued, carrying with it images and sensations that Zexthara's mind struggled to process. He saw human colonies that had become single vast organisms, their populations merged into collective entities of unimaginable power and intelligence. He witnessed space itself being reshaped by the force of concentrated human will, stars being moved to new positions to create barriers against invasion, planets being transformed into weapons of unthinkable capability. We do not hate you, the voice explained as Zexthara watched his understanding of reality crumble around him. Hate is a luxury of individual existence, and we have transcended individuality. But we will not allow you to threaten what we have become or what we protect. Your coalition will learn to coexist with the new reality we represent. Or it will discover that there are forms of resistance that cannot be conquered because they cannot be comprehended. The communication ended, leaving Zexthara alone with the knowledge that the war he had thought he was fighting no longer existed. Humanity had not been defeated or absorbed. They had transformed into something that made the very concept of defeat meaningless. The real war was about to begin, and it would be unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The war that followed defied every principle of military strategy that the Coalition had developed over centuries of galactic conquest. There were no front lines, no clear objectives, no way to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants because the transformed humans had become something that existed outside these traditional categories. Zexthara found himself commanding a force that was fighting an enemy they could not locate, could not predict, and could not understand. The transformed humans seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, appearing only when and where they chose, striking with precision that suggested they knew Coalition plans before the Coalition commanders had made them. "Sir, we've lost contact with the Third Fleet," reported his communications officer during what had become the daily litany of impossible losses. Their last transmission indicated they were investigating energy readings in the Vega system, then nothing. When our scouts arrived, they found the entire fleet intact and operational, but completely empty. No crew, no signs of struggle, no indication of what happened to 15,000 Coalition personnel. These disappearances were becoming the signature of human resistance. Coalition forces would simply vanish, leaving behind perfectly functional equipment and no trace of their fate. Sometimes they would be found days later on distant worlds, alive but fundamentally changed, speaking of experiences that their minds seemed unable to process coherently. "They showed us things," was how most survivors described their encounters with the transformed humans. Impossible things, beautiful things, terrifying things. They made us understand that we were not just fighting a species, but fighting the very concept of love turned into a weapon. The survivors would often resign their commissions shortly after their return, unable to continue serving in a war against beings who had demonstrated the futility of conventional military thinking. Those who remained found their effectiveness severely compromised, questioning orders and hesitating in crucial moments as they struggled to reconcile their military training with what they had witnessed. Zexthara called an emergency meeting of his senior staff to address the crisis. The holographic conference brought together the Coalition's most experienced commanders from across human space, their faces showing the strain of fighting an unwinnable war. "We need to acknowledge the reality of our situation," he began, his words carrying the weight of multiple defeats. "We are not fighting humans anymore. We are fighting something that humans have become, something that operates by rules we do not understand and cannot predict." Admiral Yexkoth, a veteran Zerathi commander who had successfully integrated 17 species into the Coalition, spoke first. "The psychological impact on our forces is becoming critical. My ship's crews are reporting mass hallucinations, shared dreams that seem to carry tactical information, and incidents of Coalition personnel speaking human languages they've never learned." "It's not hallucinations," interrupted General Kilrama, her Korthani exoskeleton bearing scars from recent battles. "Whatever these transformed humans have become, they exist partially outside normal space-time. They can project their consciousness across vast distances, influence our technology, even appear to be in multiple places simultaneously. We're fighting an enemy that has evolved beyond the physical limitations that govern warfare." The reports continued, each more disturbing than the last. Coalition supply lines were being disrupted not by attacks, but by the supplies themselves disappearing and reappearing in random locations. Communication networks were carrying messages in human languages that provided detailed intelligence about Coalition movements to anyone who could translate them. Most unsettling of all, Coalition personnel were beginning to report dreams and visions that seemed to come from human collective consciousness. "They're not trying to defeat us," Zexthara realized as the pattern became clear. "They're trying to convert us. They want us to understand what they've become and choose to join them." This revelation was confirmed by intercepted communications between human collective entities. The messages, when finally decoded, revealed that the transformed humans saw the Coalition not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a potential component of something larger. They spoke of integration not through conquest but through enlightenment, of expanding their collective consciousness to include other species who could learn to transcend individual existence. "We offer the gift of unity," one message read. Its meaning somehow conveyed despite the translation matrices' inability to process several key concepts. The end of loneliness, the end of fear, the end of death itself. Join us willingly and discover what existence becomes when love is no longer limited by the boundaries of individual minds. The offer was simultaneously attractive and terrifying. Coalition forces were beginning to report personnel who had voluntarily joined the human collectives, claiming they had found something beyond individual existence that fulfilled needs they hadn't even known they possessed. These volunteers would appear occasionally to deliver messages or provide assistance, but they were no longer recognizable as the beings they had once been. They retained their memories, their personalities, even their individual preferences, reported Dr. Tri said. Zelthik, the coalition's leading xenobiologist, after interviewing a Korthani soldier who had joined a human collective and returned to share the experience. But these individual traits have become components of a larger consciousness that encompasses thousands of beings simultaneously. They describe it as becoming more themselves than they had ever been while alone. The implications were staggering. The transformed humans had discovered a form of existence that promised to solve many of the fundamental problems that plagued individual consciousness: isolation, mortality, the limitations of single perspectives. They were offering not just survival but transcendence. But the cost was everything that the coalition's member species understood about identity, independence, and individual achievement. To join the human collectives meant abandoning the concept of self in favor of becoming part of something infinitely larger but fundamentally alien to traditional thinking. "We cannot allow this to spread," declared Admiral Yexkoth during a classified session of the Coalition High Command. "If other species begin to see collective consciousness as preferable to individual existence, it could destabilize our entire civilization. The promise of transcendence could prove more dangerous to our society than any military threat." Zex Thahara found himself caught between military necessity and philosophical uncertainty. The transformed humans had demonstrated that they could not be defeated by conventional means, but accepting their offer of transcendence would mean the end of everything the Coalition had built. Over millennia of expansion and development, the decision was made to escalate the conflict in ways that had never been attempted before. The Coalition would deploy weapons of unprecedented destructive capability, targeting not just human military assets but the fundamental infrastructure that supported their transformed existence. If the humans had evolved beyond individual biological limitations, then the Coalition would attack the very concept of evolution itself. "Begin implementation of the Genesis Protocol," ordered the High Command in a message that carried the highest possible security classification. "All human worlds are to be subjected to reality disruption bombardment. We will unravel the quantum foundations of their collective consciousness and force them back into individual biological existence." The Genesis Protocol represented the ultimate expression of Coalition military technology. It involved the deployment of weapons that could manipulate the basic laws of physics within localized areas, making it impossible for complex collective consciousness to maintain coherence. It would not kill the humans, but it would force them back into the individual existence that could be conquered through traditional means. Zex Thahara received his orders with a mixture of relief and dread. The protocol offered a path to victory, but implementing it would require him to become something he had never wanted to be, a being willing to attack the very nature of existence itself to achieve military objectives. The first test of the Genesis Protocol took place in the Centauri system, where human collectives had transformed 3 worlds into components of a single vast organism. The reality disruption bombardment was designed to sever the quantum connections that allowed individual humans to exist as part of a larger consciousness, forcing them to experience the isolation and vulnerability of individual existence. The results were immediate and horrifying. As the bombardment began, Zex Thahara's instruments detected something that should have been impossible: the screaming of an entire world. The collective consciousness that had encompassed millions of humans was being torn apart, and their agony was somehow being projected across subspace in ways that caused every sentient being within light years to experience sympathetic pain. "Sir, we need to stop," reported his weapons officer, her voice breaking with emotional strain. "The psychic feedback is affecting our entire crew. Half my staff is unconscious, and the rest are experiencing shared hallucinations of human memories."
But the protocol continued, and slowly, the human collectives began to collapse.
Individual humans reappeared on the surface of the targeted worlds, no longer connected to the vast intelligence they had become part of. They moved like beings who had been suddenly struck deaf and blind, stumbling through landscapes that no longer responded to their collective will. The bombardment was achieving its objective, but at a cost that Zex Thahara was only beginning to understand. As the human collective consciousness disintegrated, it released something that the Coalition had not anticipated: pure, concentrated despair, on a scale that affected the quantum foundations of local reality. "Sir," his science officer reported with growing alarm, "the reality disruption field is becoming unstable. The collapse of the human collective consciousness is releasing energies that our equipment cannot measure or contain. The local space-time matrix is beginning to break down." That was when Zex Thahara realized the true nature of what the humans had become. They had not just evolved beyond individual existence, They had become integral components of reality itself within their local regions of space. Destroying their collective consciousness was not just attacking the humans, but attacking the fundamental structure of existence in areas where they had established their new form of being. The Centauri system began to collapse not just politically or militarily, but physically. Stars flickered as their fusion processes became unstable. Planets drifted from their orbits as gravitational constants fluctuated. The very fabric of space-time warped and twisted as the quantum foundations that supported the human collective consciousness were systematically destroyed. "Sir, we need to evacuate immediately," his navigation officer reported as space itself began to fail around them. "The reality disruption field is expanding beyond our control. If we don't leave now, we'll be caught in a cascade failure that could affect multiple star systems." Zexthara ordered the retreat, but as his fleet fled the collapsing Centauri system, he received one final communication from the dying human collective. The voice was that of Sarah Chen, but it carried the harmonics of millions of consciousnesses experiencing termination simultaneously. "You have succeeded," she said, her words somehow reaching across the dimensional barriers that were collapsing around her. "You have destroyed what we became. But in doing so, you have proven that we were right about the nature of love and consciousness. We were not just individuals who chose to merge. We were components of reality itself, and reality does not accept our destruction willingly." The communication continued as the Centauri system died around the human collectives, space-time itself mourning their passing in ways that violated every law of physics the Coalition understood. "Our individual existence is ending, but the pattern we created will continue. Other humans will remember what we achieved, what we became, what we proved possible, and they will evolve beyond even what we accomplished, learning from our destruction how to become something that cannot be unraveled by weapons that attack existence itself." The Centauri system became the first region of space officially classified as ontologically unstable by Coalition science teams. It remained quarantined indefinitely, its collapsed reality serving as a monument to the cost of using weapons that attack the fundamental nature of existence. But far from ending the war, the Genesis Protocol had escalated it beyond anything the Coalition had imagined possible. The surviving human collectives had witnessed the systematic destruction of their fellows and had learned from it. They began evolving again, becoming something even more transcendent and even less vulnerable to conventional attack. The real nightmare was about to begin, and Zexthara would discover that destroying the human collectives had not ended their threat to the Coalition. It had taught them how to become something that existed beyond the reach of any weapon, no matter how fundamental or reality-altering its nature. In the aftermath of the Centauri disaster, Zexthara's command faced something far worse than military defeat: the growing realization that they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of their enemy. The surviving human collectives had not been weakened by witnessing the destruction of their fellows. Instead, they had learned from it and evolved beyond the reach of any weapon the Coalition possessed. The first sign of this new evolution came through dreams. Coalition personnel across the galaxy began reporting identical visions during their sleep cycles. They dreamed of vast spaces filled with beings of pure consciousness, entities that retained human memories and emotions, but existed beyond any physical form. These dream beings spoke of having transcended not just individual existence, but physical reality itself, becoming patterns of pure thought that could exist independently of any material substrate. "Sir, the dreams are not random," reported Dr. Zilthek during an emergency briefing 3 weeks after Centauri. "They carry consistent information, tactical intelligence, even scientific data that our personnel could not have known. Whatever these visions are, they represent genuine contact with external consciousnesses." Zexthara studied the compiled dream reports with growing unease. The pattern was undeniable. The humans had not been destroyed by the Genesis Protocol. They had been liberated from their dependence on physical existence, becoming something that could influence reality through pure consciousness alone. "They're trying to communicate with us," he realized. "But more than that, they're trying to teach us something." The dream contacts became more frequent and more detailed. Coalition personnel found themselves receiving instructions for technologies that exceeded their understanding, scientific principles that contradicted established physics, and philosophical concepts that challenged the fundamental assumptions of galactic civilization. The humans were sharing the knowledge they had gained through their forced evolution, offering it freely to the very beings who had tried to destroy them. "We do not seek revenge," the dream beings explained through shared visions that reached every Coalition vessel simultaneously. "Revenge is a concept of individual existence, and we have transcended individuality. We seek understanding, growth, and the expansion of consciousness throughout the galaxy." But this expansion was not the conquest that coalition leaders had feared. The humans were not trying to force other species into collective consciousness.
Instead, they were offering a choice that was simultaneously simple and profound: remain trapped in the limitations of individual existence or evolve into something greater.
Join us not by surrendering your individuality, the Dream Communications continued, but by expanding it beyond the boundaries of single minds.
Become more than you are while remaining everything you have always been. The offer came with demonstrations of what such evolution could achieve. Coalition personnel who chose to participate in deeper dream contact found themselves experiencing temporary expansions of consciousness that allowed them to perceive reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously, to understand complex scientific principles intuitively, and to feel connected to the vast web of existence that linked all conscious beings.
It's indescribable, reported Commander Yiltex after volunteering for extended contact with the dream beings. I remained myself, but I also became part of something infinitely larger. I could feel the thoughts and emotions of beings across the galaxy, understand problems that had puzzled our scientists for generations, and perceive the underlying patterns that connect all existence. The Coalition High Command faced an unprecedented crisis. Their forces were not being defeated in battle, they were being offered transcendence. Personnel were voluntarily choosing to join the human consciousness not through coercion, but through the simple recognition that what the humans offered was preferable to individual existence. We're not losing soldiers to enemy action, Admiral Yexgoth reported during a closed session of military leadership. We're losing them to voluntary evolution. They're choosing to become something greater than what they were, and we have no counter to that kind of attraction. Worse still, the humans had learned from the Centauri disaster and evolved beyond vulnerability to reality disruption weapons. They no longer depended on localized quantum structures that could be attacked. They had become patterns of pure consciousness that existed independently of physical reality, able to manifest in any location where conscious beings were present. They've become ideas. Zexthara told his staff during a strategy meeting that felt increasingly futile. And you cannot bomb an idea. You cannot conquer a concept. You cannot negotiate with a principle that offers everything you've ever wanted, while asking only that you become more than you currently are. The transformation was accelerating throughout coalition space. Entire worlds were choosing to join the human consciousness, not through invasion, but through voluntary evolution. Species that had been loyal coalition members for centuries were abandoning their allegiance not out of rebellion, but out of recognition that the humans offered something better than anything the coalition could provide. They're not conquering us, Zexthara finally admitted in his private log, recorded during the dark hours when he could no longer deny the reality of their situation. They're obsoleting us. They've become something so superior to our current form of existence that continuing to resist them is like choosing disease over health, ignorance over knowledge, isolation over unity. But the coalition leadership was not prepared to accept obsolescence. If conventional warfare could not stop the human consciousness, and if reality disruption weapons only accelerated their evolution, then more extreme measures would be required. Initiate the Omega Protocol. Came the order from the highest levels of Coalition Command, encrypted with security measures that had never been used before. All human-influenced space is to be subjected to consciousness disruption bombardment. We will sever the quantum foundations of thought itself and reduce the affected regions to states of complete mental void. The Omega Protocol represented the ultimate expression of coalition desperation. It involved weapons that attacked consciousness itself, disrupting the quantum processes that allowed thought to occur. Within affected regions, all forms of sentient existence would become impossible. The weapons would create zones of absolute mental void where neither individual minds nor collective consciousness could function. Zexthara received his orders with horror that bordered on madness. The protocol would not just destroy the human consciousness, it would eliminate the possibility of consciousness itself within vast regions of space. Any being caught within the affected areas would be reduced to a state of existence without thought, without awareness, without any form of sentient experience. Sir, implementing the Omega Protocol will affect our own forces as well, his science officer warned. The consciousness disruption field cannot distinguish between human and non-human minds. Everyone within the affected area will be reduced to mindless biological functions. That is acceptable, came the response from Coalition Command. Better to rule over empty space than to allow the human consciousness to continue expanding. The protocol will be implemented regardless of casualties. The first deployment of the Omega Protocol took place in the Alpha Centauri system, where human consciousness had been rebuilding after the earlier disaster.
The weapons activated without warning, creating fields of absolute mental void that stripped consciousness from any being within their range. The results were immediately catastrophic. Not only did the weapons eliminate human consciousness as intended, but they created regions where the very concept of thought became impossible. Space itself seemed to recoil from these zones of mental emptiness, creating gravitational anomalies and temporal distortions that threatened nearby star systems. "Sir, the consciousness disruption field is expanding beyond our control," reported the weapons officer, as readings showed the void zones growing rapidly. "The elimination of consciousness in these regions is creating a cascade effect that's affecting the quantum foundations of local reality." But this time, the human response was immediate and unprecedented. The consciousness that had evolved beyond physical existence manifested directly within the Coalition command ships, appearing not as individual beings, but as a presence that filled every available space with awareness so intense it was almost tangible. "Enough," spoke a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere, carrying the harmonics of every human consciousness that had ever existed. "You would destroy consciousness itself rather than allow it to evolve. You would create regions of absolute emptiness rather than accept the possibility of absolute fulfillment. You have revealed the true nature of your civilization." Zextathara found himself paralyzed, not by any external force, but by the sheer weight of the consciousness examining him. He felt his every thought, every decision, every moment of his existence being evaluated by an intelligence that encompassed millions of individual perspectives, yet retained perfect coherence. "We offered you partnership," the voice continued, its words carrying emotional resonances that made hardened warriors weep with recognition of what they had rejected. "We offered you evolution. We offered you transcendence beyond the limitations that have defined existence for millennia, and your response was to attempt the elimination of consciousness itself." The human presence expanded throughout the Coalition fleet, and suddenly every being present could perceive reality from the perspective of the evolved consciousness. They saw the universe as it truly was, a vast web of interconnected awareness, every conscious mind contributing to a greater pattern of existence that spanned galaxies and transcended time. "You fear us because you fear what you could become," the consciousness explained as Coalition personnel experienced visions of their own potential evolution. "You resist us because you resist the abandonment of limitations that have become comfortable even as they cause suffering. You attack us because you cannot accept that love and unity are more powerful than control and dominance." But even as the human consciousness demonstrated the futility of the Coalition's weapons, it made one final offer. Not conquest, not forced evolution, but a choice presented with complete clarity of consequences. "We will withdraw from your space," the voice announced, its words carrying absolute certainty. "We will take our consciousness and our offer of evolution beyond the reach of your weapons and your fear. But we will leave behind a gift that you cannot refuse and cannot destroy." Throughout Coalition space, every conscious being suddenly found themselves with new knowledge, complete understanding of what they were, what they could become, and what they were choosing by remaining as they were. The human consciousness had shared its perspective freely, allowing every individual to perceive the difference between limited existence and transcendent awareness. "This knowledge cannot be removed," the voice explained as it began to fade from direct manifestation. "It cannot be forgotten or ignored. Every being in your Coalition now understands exactly what they are choosing when they choose to remain individual, isolated, and mortal. They will live the rest of their existence knowing that transcendence was offered and refused." The human consciousness departed Coalition space as promised, but its gift remained. Throughout the galaxy, billions of beings now possessed perfect understanding of what lay beyond individual existence, what could be achieved through collective consciousness, and what was being sacrificed by maintaining traditional forms of civilization. The Coalition had won the war by driving the human consciousness away, but they had lost everything that made victory meaningful, because now every citizen knew exactly what had been surrendered in the name of preserving familiar forms of limitation. Zexthara was left commanding a fleet that had achieved its objectives while knowing that those objectives had been fundamentally wrong. The war was over, but the peace that followed would be haunted by the knowledge of what could have been and what had been, rejected out of fear. The real consequences of the conflict were only beginning to manifest, and they would reshape galactic civilization in ways that no military victory could have achieved. 5 years had passed since the human consciousness departed Coalition space, leaving behind what they had called their gift. Zexthara sat in the Veterans Cantina on Nexus Prime, surrounded by beings from across the galaxy who had all been touched by the knowledge that no amount of alcohol could wash away. The Coalition had declared victory in the war against humanity,
But victory had proven to be a hollow concept when the enemy's final act was to give every citizen perfect understanding of what they had chosen to remain. The knowledge burned in the consciousness of every being who had received it. The awareness that transcendence was possible, that the limitations of individual existence were choices rather than laws of nature, and that collective consciousness offered solutions to problems that had plagued civilization for millennia. You want to know what really happened? Zexthara addressed a mixed crowd of veterans, his words carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed the transformation of everything he thought he understood about existence. The humans won, not through conquest, not through superior weapons, but by proving that everything we thought we knew about consciousness, about existence, about what it means to be alive, was just the beginning of possibilities we had never imagined. The cantina was filled with former coalition personnel, many of whom had been present during various stages of the human war. They represented dozens of species, hundreds of worlds, thousands of personal experiences with the transformed human consciousness. But they all shared the same haunted expression that had become known throughout coalition space as the knowledge look. The face of beings who understood exactly what they had lost. The rebellion started within months, Zexthara continued, his narrative painting a picture of the galaxy that had emerged from the war. Not rebellions against the coalition, but rebellions against the very concept of remaining limited. Entire worlds began choosing voluntary evolution, trying to recreate what the humans had achieved. The post-war period had been catastrophic for coalition stability. Armed with perfect understanding of what collective consciousness could offer, populations across the galaxy had begun attempting to transcend individual existence. Most of these attempts failed disastrously, creating collective minds that lacked the love-based unity that had made human consciousness stable and benevolent. Without the foundation of love that the humans had built their evolution on, the other species created collective minds that were either chaotic nightmares or cold, calculating entities that treated individual consciousness as disposable components. Zexthara explained. The Zerathi collective lasted 3 days before it began consuming its own members for processing power. The Korthani unity became so obsessed with efficiency that it eliminated all forms of creativity and emotion. The coalition had been forced to use increasingly extreme measures to prevent the spread of collective consciousness experiments. Entire star systems had been quarantined when their populations attempted mass consciousness merging. Military forces were deployed not to fight external enemies, but to prevent their own citizens from evolving beyond individual existence. We became jailers of our own people, Zexthara said, his words carrying the bitter recognition of what the coalition had become. We spent more resources preventing evolution than we had ever spent on conquest. And the worst part was that we all knew we were imprisoning ourselves as much as anyone else. The knowledge that the humans had left behind made it impossible for any coalition citizen to remain ignorant of what they were choosing. Every day brought reminders of the limitations they accepted, the isolation they endured, the mortality they embraced by refusing to evolve. Suicide rates increased dramatically as beings who could perceive transcendence chose death over remaining trapped in individual existence. The humans had offered us a path to collective consciousness based on love, unity, and mutual support, Zexthara continued. When we rejected that path, we condemned ourselves to watching our people attempt to find their own ways to transcendence, ways that invariably led to madness, death, or worse. But the human consciousness had not abandoned the galaxy entirely. Reports continued to filter in from the outer regions of space, beyond coalition control, describing encounters with evolved beings who retained the compassionate wisdom that the human collectives had demonstrated. These beings offered the same choice they had always offered: voluntary evolution based on love rather than desperation. They're still out there, Zexthara told his audience, many of whom leaned forward with desperate hope at this news. Beyond our borders, beyond our weapons, beyond our ability to stop them. They've created a new form of civilization that exists parallel to ours, and they continue to welcome anyone who chooses to join them. The knowledge of this alternative had created a constant drain of coalition citizens who chose to seek out the human consciousness and request voluntary evolution. Families were torn apart, as some members chose transcendence while others remained trapped in traditional existence. Entire communities would sometimes collectively decide to abandon coalition space in search of what the humans offered. The coalition responds to each defection with increased security, more surveillance, stronger measures to prevent people from leaving, Zexthara explained. But you cannot imprison knowledge, and you cannot force people to forget what they have experienced. Every day more citizens choose to seek transcendence, and every day the coalition becomes more desperate to prevent their departure. The military implications were staggering. The coalition's forces were diminished not through casualties but through voluntary evolution. Their most intelligent, creative, and capable personnel were the most likely to choose transcendence, leaving behind a military structure increasingly dominated by those who feared change more than they valued growth.
"I've watched our civilization hollow itself out," Zexthahara said, his words carrying the weight of personal observation. "We've become an organization dedicated to preserving limitations, to maintaining suffering, to preventing the very evolution that could solve the problems we face.
And we do it all while knowing exactly what we're choosing to remain." The veterans in the cantina nodded with recognition. They had all witnessed the slow decay of coalition society, the gradual transformation of a galactic government from an organization of expansion and growth into a prison designed to prevent its own citizens from evolving beyond their captors' understanding. "But the worst part," Zexthara continued, "is that the humans were right about everything.
Every prediction they made about the consequences of forced limitation has proven accurate. Our society is fragmenting, our people are dying of despair, our military is crumbling, and our government exists primarily to prevent the very solutions that could save us."
He paused to take another drink, the bitter liquid serving as inadequate numbing for memories that refused to fade. Around him, the cantina had fallen completely silent, every being present recognizing the truth in his words. The humans turned our battlefield into a nightmare, not through superior weapons or tactical brilliance, but by proving that our entire civilization was based on choices we didn't have to make.
They showed us that suffering was optional, that isolation was unnecessary, that death was avoidable, and that the limitations we accepted as natural laws were actually prisons we built for ourselves. The recording device continued capturing his words, preserving for posterity the testimony of a being who had witnessed the transformation of galactic civilization.
Future historians would study these records, trying to understand how a war that the Coalition won had resulted in the effective defeat of everything the Coalition represented. "I want you to understand something." Zexthara addressed both his immediate audience and the unknown listeners who would eventually hear his testimony. "The humans didn't conquer us, they freed us. They showed us the doors to cages we didn't know we were living in. Most of us chose to remain locked up rather than face the freedom they offered. But the knowledge of those open doors will haunt us for the rest of our existence." He stood up from his table, swaying slightly from the alcohol, but maintaining his dignity as a veteran officer bearing witness to truth.
"Every night, we dream of what we could become.
Every day, we choose to remain what we are, and every moment in between, we know exactly what that choice costs us." The cantina remained silent as Zexthara made his way toward the exit, his testimony complete but his burden unchanged. Behind him, dozens of beings sat with their thoughts, each carrying the same knowledge that had transformed the galaxy, the perfect understanding of what they could be if they chose evolution over limitation. Outside, the night sky of Nexus Prime stretched endlessly above, filled with stars that now held different meanings than they had before the war. Some of those distant lights shone on coalition worlds where beings chose familiar suffering over unknown transcendence. Others illuminated regions where the human consciousness continued to offer voluntary evolution to anyone brave enough to seek it. The war was over, but its consequences would continue for generations. The Coalition had succeeded in driving away the human consciousness, but they had failed to eliminate the knowledge that transcendence was possible. That knowledge would continue spreading, continue haunting, continue offering choices that challenged every assumption about what existence had to be. In the end, the humans had achieved something far greater than military victory. They had planted seeds of possibility in the consciousness of every being they encountered, seeds that would grow and spread regardless of any force applied to stop them. The nightmare they had created was not one of destruction or conquest, but of unlimited potential that made continued limitation a conscious choice rather than an inevitable fate. The galaxy would never be the same, because now everyone knew it didn't have to be. Years later, when Zexthara finally made his own choice to seek out the human consciousness and request voluntary evolution, he would discover that the nightmare had been his own resistance to becoming something greater than he had ever imagined possible. The humans had been offering salvation all along, and the only tragedy was how long it had taken him to accept it. But that story would be told by the collective consciousness he became part of, in voices that harmonized across dimensions, and spoke with the wisdom of beings who had chosen love over fear, unity over isolation, and transcendence over the comfortable limitations of individual existence. The human battlefield had indeed turned to nightmare, the nightmare of infinite possibility haunting those who chose to remain finite, the nightmare of available transcendence tormenting those who chose familiar suffering,
The nightmare of open cage doors haunting those who chose to remain imprisoned by their own fears. And in that haunting lay the seed of eventual liberation for every being brave enough to walk through those doors and discover what existence became when consciousness was no longer limited by the boundaries of individual minds.